Okay, welcome. So we're going to look at chapter 11 in this PowerPoint. And so some of the things we're going to go over here is looking at really how do you choose the materials in terms of flooring, walls, doors, and some of you may never have thought about it, but you may kind of be able to think about if you've been in kitchens or worked in kitchens, what some of the materials are used and why. So we'll look at some of that and then what you have to have for restrooms, hand washing stations, etc. So let's look at a construction plan. So there are some plans that need approval by the local regulatory authority. And so some of these reviews just make sure that designs meet requirements, that there's safe flow of food going in and out of a kitchen, make sure that the facility is constructed up to code, similar things that are required if someone's building a house or different buildings. So really looking at these plans and having them approved by the regulatory authority before you start getting too far deep in the process is helpful if you're ever designing a new restaurant and kitchen. So we've all probably been in kitchens that have a good layout and maybe a poor layout, and really when we have a kitchen that has a poor layout, it can make it inefficient. If your cooler is really far away from where you're prepping, maybe food gets left out longer, etc. So a good workflow will, for food safety purposes, will address how much time a food spends in the danger zone and limits the number of times a food is handled. So lots of things to think about. There's also obviously a lot of other layout things to think about in terms of efficiency and staff function, etc. But for food safety, that's really what we're looking at. We also want to minimize the risk of contamination. So, you don't want where everyone's cutting up the chicken to be right next to where the dishwasher station may have water splashing into that area. So we really just want to make sure things are laid out to prevent contamination and that it's easy to clean the equipment. People probably have that at home if you think about, if you drop something behind the stove or the refrigerator, it can be really difficult to get it out. In a commercial kitchen where we're cooking a lot more, we really want it to be easy to clean all of the equipment, etc. So keep that in mind. When we look at flooring, ServSafe likes to use the words especially durable, non-absorbent, smooth. You want something that's easy to clean, that's slip resistant. All of those things matter. Porosity too, so how much that material will absorb liquids is important. And really just be careful, if we think about like something like a hardwood floor, that really wouldn't be great in a kitchen because, you're going to have a lot of liquid and water and dishes and things like that. So we need to just think about what type of flooring is best for different parts of our restaurant. So we really want all of these areas to have non-absorbent flooring, so walk-in coolers, all of our prep and food storage areas, dishwashing, restrooms, and then if they have dressing and or locker rooms, all of those things have those non-absorbent flooring. They don't really have the same restrictions for the dining room, right? You could theoretically have hardwood floors or carpet or whatever in a dining room. It still should be something that's easy, that you can clean fairly easily, but it doesn't have some of the same restrictions as some of these other areas would. So non-porous resilient flooring, why is that advantageous? So it's typically pretty inexpensive, wears well, tends to resist grease and other alkalis. It can be easily damaged and can get kind of slippery, so we want to be careful about some of those. Our hard surface floorings tend to be durable, maybe slip resistant. Again, they may be easily damaged. They're a little bit more expensive, maybe a little bit more difficult to clean on those. Carpeting is sound absorbent, easy to maintain, but it's not necessarily good for high dirt areas, and it may require routine cleaning. Typically, like it will say, we may see carpeting in a dining room. But again, it's normally a high traffic carpet that's kind of made for that type of area, but it's just something to think about. In these high traffic areas like the kitchen, pretty much the whole kitchen, making sure we really have those non-slip surfaces. We also may use rubber mats where we may have any standing water, so a dishwasher area, etc. We also have this concept of coving, and so I'll have you look at that picture, and you can also look at that if you're in any kitchen, and because it always looks a little bit different. But really, coving is what you have that's really kind of a little curved edge where the floor and wall meet. And what that does is eliminate the risk that food will get trapped into that kind of 90-degree angle that's hard to sweep out. And so we want to eliminate really hiding place for pests and make it easier to clean. I will say though that poorly done coving or coving that's starting to come off can actually be worse, because then you have kind of hidden hiding spots that you can't even see for a pest. So coving is great, but we just want to make sure it's in good shape when we're using it to get the benefits. So what about walls? This is something you've probably never thought about, but we really want them to also be non-absorbent, smooth, durable, easy to clean. You know, we're not necessarily needing to sanitize our walls the same way we sanitize some of our other surfaces, but make sure we can clean them. When we look at a dry storage area, also, again, they really like easy to clean materials. That's important. We really want good air circulation as well. That's really important to prevent things from molding and mildewing and different problems happening in a dry storage area as well. Make sure anything is food grade. So if it's food grade, if you've got plastic, it should be a food grade. You don't want direct sunlight. Any water lines too, I have seen this where water lines will leak over some dry storage areas, so you want to try to avoid that as well. And then we'll talk about some of these other things, self-closing doors, screens on windows and doors. That's obviously important for keeping pests out and making sure that, you know, we are keeping it a safe, clean environment. So if we're looking at hand washing stations, where do we need them? So they need to be convenient. They should obviously be in restrooms, or they'll stay directly next to them. Theoretically, it's not in the restroom itself, depending on how the area is set up. Food prep areas, service areas, and dishwashing areas should have hand washing stations. They should only be used for hand washing. So again, you shouldn't put your dirty dishes, you shouldn't wash produce, anything like that into hand washing station, just for hand washing. You can see the barriers there, distance from food or food contact surfaces. If that's necessary, depending on where it is in your facility, you may need that little barrier that's there in the first picture. Obviously, they should be working, important. Stock to maintain, and remember we talked about those things that it needs to have, so hot and cold running water, soap, a way to dry hands, a sign, and a trash can. And I have seen them blocked, and so they will knock you on this if they come in and it's very clear that you've got a hand washing station in this area, but your staff can't get to it. So you want to make sure that it's always available. So here's these things that it must have. Again, we talked about that earlier in the semester, but just want to make sure you guys are aware of those things that are required. And then when we're looking at sinks, really, and we talked about this with hand washing sinks, but make sure we're only using them for their intended purpose. So hand washing sinks for hand washing, prep sinks for prep or washing vegetables or whatever. And then a service sink like this mop sink should only be used for that as well. They do require one service sink, and a lot of times it may be in a closet or something like that, but they do require that as a way to get rid of dirty mop water and things, so you're not pouring that in your prep sink or your hand washing sink. When we look at restrooms, there should be separate restrooms for staff and guests when possible. Again, I kind of laugh at that sometimes, since I know that's not normally realistic for a lot of restaurants, depending on the space, but if they are shared, they must be designed so guests do not go through prep areas, which most restaurants are set up like that. I can't remember going to a restaurant where I had to like walk through the kitchen to go to the bathroom or anything, but I just want to make sure they're in a way that that doesn't happen. Should be sanitary, should be adequately stocked, have garbage containers, nothing crazy on this slide. If you do have dressing rooms and lockers, again, make sure that it's not used for any food prep or food storage. You don't want to like store your extra tortilla chips in the locker room or anything like that, so just be careful about that. So when you're designing, and again, a lot of us don't have control of these, but if you're able to look at like where parking lots and walkways are, great. You want to prevent standing water. You really want to grade them in a way that you don't necessarily have water standing up against the restaurant. Again, no living or sleeping quarters there, and then no guest traffic through prep areas. Again, I've never been in a restaurant where I have to like walk through the kitchen to get into my table, but just make sure we're thinking about those kind of things. Okay, equipment standards, and this is important because not all cooking equipment is necessarily appropriate for a commercial kitchen. And so we've got the NFS mark, which ensures that these equipments are kind of meet those requirements for being non-absorbent, smooth, corrosion resistant, easy to clean, durable, resistant to damage, all of those things that you've heard those words so many times already in this chapter. That's important. So that NSF mark, sorry, it says NFS up there, it's NSF on there. Make sure you look for that mark on things. And you can see it on equipment. We have it on our stainless steel tables. If you haven't seen it, next time you're in the hospitality and culinary building, if you are, go look at some of the equipment and you should be able to find that on it. There are a couple different kinds of dishwashing machines as well to know. So there's single tank, that you have stationary rack machines that have doors. You also have conveyor, where it goes through like a conveyor belt, another kind of carousel or circular conveyor machine, flight type, batch type, and recirculating door types. So there's lots of different kinds on that. Don't stress out too much about the individual types, but make sure you understand that they should be installed in a way that they're convenient, easy to reach. You don't want them next to an area where either like clean utensils, so sometimes I'll see that, where the clean utensils are stored close by to where then they can be contaminated. Any other food contact surfaces, etc., are contaminated with, you're blasting, stuck on food off a plate, and it somehow can fly onto clean food contact surfaces. So we want to avoid that. It should be at least 6 inches off the floor, and if you remember, that's kind of our rule for everything off the floor so we can clean. Also, make sure that the water pipes are appropriate to prevent heat loss. And again, that's, it's actually a very expensive, intensive process to install a dishwashing machine. I got to see one being done this summer, but it's definitely something that you have to pay attention to. So when you're selecting the dishwasher, you want a couple of things. So you always want to know, what kind of detergent sanitizer does it use? Is it sanitized with hot water? Does it sanitize with a chemical? But make sure whatever you're using is approved by the regulatory authority. Make sure it does have gauges to measure and let you know water temperature. Most of them will have this digital readout now, but just keep that in mind, water pressure and chemical concentration. And again, you should have the settings so you can see like an example of something that may be posted on a machine, etc. So it should be easy to clean. The thermometer is easy for you to see, and again, a lot of them are digital now where it reads out on the outside, but just make sure it meets all of those requirements as well. When you're looking at 3-compartment sink, there's not necessarily a rule on how big it needs to be, but it just needs to accommodate your large equipment. So if you have a really tiny 3-compartment sink and really large stock pots, that may not work because you may not really have a great way to clean them. So just make sure those things match up. When we're looking at coolers and freezers, some things to think about. So obviously the door should withstand heavy use. And again, this is why we're really looking at these commercial items. Our home refrigerators aren't made to go through that amount of heavy use that we're going to see in a restaurant. They also must have a drain for defrosting of that. And things must be installed correctly. If it's a walk-in, it needs to be sealed to the floor and wall. A reach-in, again, either is sealed to a masonry base, or often it may be at least 6 inches off the ground. So one of those options is always required for those things. So either it's sealed so things can't get under it, or it's elevated so you can clean under. Again, the temperature requirements is important. And if you remember when we talked about thermometers and we talked about the accuracy of a thermometer that measures air temperature, which is what we would be using in this case, it needs to be plus or minus 3 degrees Fahrenheit is the accuracy needed for that thermometer for a cooler or freezer. If you have blast chillers or tumble chillers, again, just make sure that they have the proper thermometers to measure and target food temperatures as well. So also a tumble chiller, make sure that it meets all the specs, that you have the water line ready to go, etc. If you have cook chill equipment, these are equipment that can cook, cool, and reheat. So these are kind of cool. You would just want to make sure it meets all your specifications. With cutting boards, you can have wooden cutting boards or synthetic. Some places don't allow wooden cutting boards and baker's tables, or they need to be allowed by your authority, have non-absorbent, non-toxic hardwood. Some of you may not even realize this too, but even if and I didn't until I started doing some work with school gardens, but there are certain ways they even treat lumber. So even if you were like making, let's say, garden beds, you would want to make sure that you were getting lumber that wasn't sprayed with chemicals that could potentially be toxic. So same thing in this situation. A lot of times we'll see wooden boards used more in a baking pastry area. We really try to avoid using wooden boards in a lot of other areas, especially where there may be meat or more things are likely to have a higher bacteria count on that. So just keep that in mind with cutting boards. All right, we've talked about this several times, so hopefully none of you will ever miss this, but either any of the equipment on the floor must be either at least 6 inches off the ground or sealed to that masonry base. And that the point is that either nothing should be able to go under it, or you should be able to, fit a mop and broom under there and clean. Tabletop equipment is a little different. It can either be sealed to that countertop or at least 4 inches off the table. And again, same thing, so that way you can move it, clean underneath that, etc. If you've got like a slicer or something that you can physically move to clean, it doesn't necessarily have to meet these 4-inch requirements, but just keep that in mind. Okay, so maintaining equipment. This is really important because a regular maintenance schedule can help actually extend the life of a lot of equipment, and this is actually something you should really pay attention to, because I know people who haven't paid attention to this. They have big, expensive equipment, and then they're not following the maintenance schedule like they should, and then something happens and it's out of warranty. The company stopped honoring their warranty even because they didn't follow the maintenance schedule, so the warranty was no longer valid. So just keep that in mind. Normally the supplier or manufacturer of these big equipment things, you can set up a schedule where they will come out every so often and make sure it's working properly. But that typically does work in your best interest financially, because if you don't do that, again, they may not honor their warranty on the product if they can say, well, it wasn't properly maintained. So just keep that in mind. Again, acceptable sources of drinking water. It would need to be either approved public water mains. If you have private sources, they need to be routinely tested and maintained, or the portable water containers. Again, in an urban area, we're not worried about this as much, but there are certain areas where they may have to just have water checked in, or make sure it is, if they're using a private source, that it is up to code. You also need to ensure a continuous supply of hot water. So make sure hot water heaters are maintained properly. There are sometimes these little things called booster heating that can quickly heat up to a really higher temperature for hot water sanitizing, and sometimes these are installed to dishwashers and other things like that. And there's a lot of factors that go into whether it's like more cost effective and best for your facility to have a hot water sanitizing or chemical sanitizing. But whatever you choose, you just need to make sure you have the proper equipment to do that. Cross connection is something we want to prevent. So a cross connection, and I'll show you a picture, is a potential physical link between clean water and dirty water. So like you have a mop bucket or a drain or sewer, and if that could somehow get back into the clean water, then that's a cross connection. And this is a picture of an example of how this can happen, back siphonage or even backflow. And here's back siphonage, and this is kind of like a vacuum effect that can be created to where that hose is in contaminated water and also connected to the clean water. And that could potentially have that back siphonage. You could have kind of a vacuum effect that could happen, and that could end up bringing some of that contaminated water into the clean supply. So we want to prevent that. And these are 2 ways to prevent that backflow. You can have that vacuum breaker, which really will prevent that happening, or air gaps. You normally see these as well. And an air gap is just, if you can imagine, there's no way, if you look at the top, for, even if that sink fills with dirty, contaminated water, it's still not going to reach that faucet. So the faucet isn't like directly in the water, and same thing on the bottom. So that is called an air gap. So when we look at grease condensation, these grease traps are normally installed in a place that uses a lot of this to prevent grease from blocking drains. These are important. They must be installed by a plumber, cleaned regularly. This isn't a fun duty, but it's something that needs to be done to ensure that we are, it's really a safety issue too, but it can also clog up your drains, etc. So grease traps are really important on that. If there is a backup of sewage in the operation, The affected area should be obviously closed right away, must be corrected. Sometimes you may have to close the whole operation, probably most cases you may. Must be thoroughly cleaned. If it's a significant risk to food safety, again, you must stop service and notify the local regulatory authority. So definitely something that you need to pay attention to. Lighting is another thing, and this is one I've seen questions on the practice test about. So consider the following. So different areas have different lighting intensity requirements. We'll talk about these in terms of foot candles. And normally the brightest area is the prep area, and that makes sense, right? Normally the dining area doesn't need to be as bright. It does need to be light enough that you could theoretically, see the carpet and things like that to pick up any dirt, etc. But the prep area really needs to be bright, so that's a big one that we look at. We should also have shatter-resistant light bulbs or protective covers, just so you can prevent, if a light bulb breaks, falls out, you don't want it to end up in food or contaminate things as well. And this is just a great idea in general. Make sure anything burnt out, you replace the correct size bulb, correct wattage, correct voltage, because that can be a fire hazard as well. So lighting's something to look at. And again, here's this by foot candles. Again, prep area being the most. Then your hand washing, buffets, where utensils are, wait stations, restrooms, etc. And then our kind of walk-in coolers, dry storage, dining room need the least amount of light. So make sure you look at these. Ventilation is also important, and ventilation systems can improve air quality, reduce grease buildup. You can kind of see this if you've worked somewhere that has a really dirty hood. That's a sign that the ventilation isn't working properly, and then that could increase the risk for fire. Again, you don't want that grease to start building up and dripping into the food. It's not fun. So just make sure those are well maintained. Then when we look at garbage, removing garbage from prep areas as quickly as possible. Again, that doesn't mean every 30 minutes you're taking the trash out, but just make sure we're careful. You can see what this individual is doing wrong here. So don't put, I've seen this happen, don't put, dirty garbage on the clean prep table, or, be careful what it touches when you walk it out. I've seen it rub up against clean dishes and things like that, so be careful on those and not contaminate any either food or food contact surfaces. Garbage containers should also be cleaned out frequently. Again, this is something I'll see people take the trash out, but there's still trash in the bottom, or it gets dirty and it's not cleaned. So make sure those are cleaned away from food prep areas. Any indoor containers must be leak-proof, waterproof, pest-proof, easy to clean. We should cover them as much as possible when we're not using them. And then make sure it's stored away from food and food contact surfaces. Don't create a nuisance or public health hazard. We don't want to walk the dirty trash through the dining room. Making sure that the way we store it is maintaining kind of safety even outside, that it's not drawing pests, etc. So again, outdoor containers, smooth, durable, non-absorbent surface like asphalt or concrete, have tight-fitting lids, be covered at all times, have drain plugs in place. And really we want to prevent, we don't want to make our dumpsters a great place where we can have, raccoons or other things hiding up. So just keep that, or hiding out, excuse me, because that can increase risk for disease and other pests, etc. All right, thank you.